1, Isaiah chapter 5. Now let me sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved regarding his vineyard. This is romance literature of the Old Testament. Romance literature of the Old Testament. This would have fell right around the time of Song of Solomon. Solomon would have predated this just a little bit. Beloved, vineyard, all that talk is Song of Solomon talk. Song of Solomon is the risque book of the Old Testament. I know that's always kind of comical for us. It was like, how risque was it? It was so risque that you were not allowed to read it if you were a Hebrew until you were 30 years old. Because apparently at 29 it was too much. But at 30 you could handle it. So this is Song of Solomon talk. Reason I say that is when you read Song of Solomon, you talk about the beloved, we always put Jesus in there or God in there. That's okay, that's appropriate because God is the beloved one. Jesus would say, or God would say of Jesus, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. And so we're talking about God regarding his vineyard, my well-beloved, a song of my beloved regarding his vineyard. My well-beloved has a vineyard on a very fruitful hill. He dug it up and cleared out its stones and planted it with the choicest vine. Isaiah is telling you about the fact that God has planted a vineyard in a place in which he had to clear out a space so that he could plant his choicest vine. We're not to it yet, but I'll just quote to you where we're going. In verse 7, it's going to tell us that Israel and Judah are the choicest vine. So God planted in a space his choice vine, Israel. What's that clearing out business? To me, that's where Israel leaves the wilderness, crosses the Jordan, and goes into the promised land. But there are obstacles in the promised land that God has to spend a big chunk of the Old Testament clearing out a space for his people. Allegorically, it's God clearing the land so he can plant a choice vine. So God takes Israel and Judah and he plots them into a place that he has cleared out of stones and dug them out of the way. He built a tower in the middle of it and he made a wine press in it. And here's what he expected to get. He expected that it would bring forth good grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. And so Isaiah is relating to you a story in which God planted a choice vineyard in a land that he had cleared out. He cleared the promised land and put Israel in the middle of it. And what he thought was going to be his return were good grapes. I like to call this righteousness, fruits of righteousness. This is what God expected was going to grow in his vineyard. Why wouldn't it? It's a choice grape. It's a choice vine on good soil. How can it not produce good fruit? God says, I got the perfect piece of property. I have the perfect vine. I should have the perfect result. But instead, it brought forth wild grapes. And wild grapes in Hebrew allegoric language is always rebellion. So what God intended to be a righteous revolution in the promised land among his people ended up being a rebellious revolution as people began to rebel, which, as the Apostle Paul would reinterpret this, that's what happens when people begin to take the law as the source of their righteousness. The moment that you get introduced to a message in which your performance equals your right standing with God, you will rebel against that because you will find out that you're incapable of keeping these demands and will end up in a fist fight with God. That's where a lot of us exhausted ourselves before we come into an understanding of who he was and how much he loved us. So God's design was to bring forth good grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. And then he says this, and now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge please between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done to my vineyard that I haven't done in it? Why then, when I expected it to bring forth good grapes, did it bring forth wild grapes? And now please tell me, let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I'll take away the hedge so that it shall be burned. I'll break down its wall and it shall be trampled down. I want to stay right there for a moment. God says, I want you to judge between me and I want you to judge between my vineyard, which is an Old Testament way of saying, I want you to measure in the balances who's right and who's wrong. Tell me, did I do everything I could for my people? When you get to the end of 2 Chronicles, which by the way is the end of the Hebrew Bible, as we know, it's the end of the Hebrew history. Most everything that happens in your major prophet, minor prophets, that big chunk of space in your Old Testament, it happens inside the Chronicles and the Kings. They just get parsed out into the individual books as we go through the Christian Bible. But individually, that whole incident happens before you get done with 2 Chronicles. When you get to the end of 2 Chronicles, God says to Israel that I did everything that I could for you. I provided you with everything that I could, and still you didn't produce the fruit that you should have been able to produce. And so it's almost as if at the end of the canon of the Old Covenant, God says, I did all I could do, and the best that can happen in this environment is wildness. The best that can happen, and I look at it this way, the best that can happen in an environment of the law is wildness. You might get people who can check their attitude because they're being judged peripherally by their neighbor, but you will not be a fruit producer in an environment that demands your performance in order to give you righteousness. There's no way you'll produce good fruit. You'll only do what Jesus said of the Pharisees. You cross the ocean and make another proselyte who's twofold the child of hell that you are. Good grief. Can you imagine hearing that sermon on a Sunday morning? You're going to go out here and try to create some converts this week, church, and they're twice the kid of hell you are. That was Jesus preaching to the Pharisees who had propped themselves up as bastions of righteousness under old performance standards. And so what's God say He's going to do? I'm going to come break the wall down. I'm going to burn the thing to the ground. There's going to be a judgment against this system. By the way, most of what you read in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, leave John out because John doesn't give you any eschatology. Most of what you read in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is Jesus speaking to a generation who was not giving fruit to hungry people. That's why He cursed the fig tree. It's also why He walked into the temple and knocked the tables over and said, you've made my Father's house, which is supposed to be a house of prayer, into a den of thieves. And so Jesus is finding Himself increasingly frustrated with a people who are only producing wild grapes, but who are not producing good fruit. God, in Isaiah chapter 5, has prophesied that He's going to tear that down. He's going to trample it. And in verse 6, I'm going to lay it waste. It shall not be pruned or dug. In other words, when I'm done with it, I'm done with it. I'm only going to prune it so long. I'm only going to dig around it so long. But there shall come up briars and thorns, and I will command the clouds that they do not rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts, here's that verse that tells us the choice vine. The vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are His pleasant plant. There's that tree, the pleasant plant. He looked for justice, but behold, all He found was oppression. He looked for righteousness, but behold, all He found was a cry for help.